Shalom. It's now about 4.5 months into the war that we Israelis have been fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the war that began on Simchat Torah, October 7th. Just a few days into the war, I posted a video, which I'll link to up here, which tried to share some very preliminary thoughts on how to make sense of this from a spiritual perspective. And what I said then, while we were all still in shock and just trying to get a grip on what was happening, what I said then was that, and I shared Torah sources that I think make this point, that when something like this happens, when we're in an Eit Sarab, when we're in a time of difficulty, we have to engage in what's called Cheshbon HaNefesh. We have to try to engage in soul searching with the goal of identifying problems that need to be corrected and to do tshuva, to repent, to try to fix those problems so that something good will come out of the situation that we're in, and hopefully that this can become a way forward. When I said that, I wasn't talking only supernaturally or mystically that God punishes us for our sins. I think that very often it's divine providence that's causing it to play out, but very often you can see a real this-worldly link between the problems that need to be fixed and the punishment, so to speak, or the results of those problems that are causing our difficulties. At the time, what I said was that it was clear to me that the biggest thing we need to work on is Achdut, is unity. And I said that on the backdrop of the terrible disunity that had been prevailing here in Israel and around the Jewish world in the months and really in the years leading up to Simchat Torah, the terrible fighting and attacking that was going on. Sinat Chinam, the baseless hatred that Jews were expressing towards one another. And I also said at the time that I thought even just 3 days into the war that we learned the lesson and we've already done tshuva. We're already fixing it. The incredible show of unity that happened instantly. Jews all over Israel and all over the world springing into action, just looking for what they could do to help. And I'm proud to say that 4.5 months later, this unity is still strong. At the same time, already then I said the big challenge is going to be what happens when war is over. How do we maintain this unity? In the 4.5 months that have passed, many, many others have said very similar things. And we're already beginning to see the challenges. The unity is still holding strong. But, first of all those things we were arguing about before, which each side felt really strongly about, and each side really believed strongly that what they thought was correct, and that what the other side thought, in many cases, wasn't just incorrect, but was very damaging and dangerous. We put a lot of that stuff aside and said, we just can't deal with this now because we have a war, so it was kind of easy to focus on the war. But we're reaching the point that those issues are looming again, and not only that, but new arguments have already begun about how to manage the war and things like that. So some of those stresses are coming up again. And what does it mean to maintain unity? How do we maintain unity when we have to have these arguments? Do we have to, in the name of unity, just give up on everything we believe? Is unity more important than anything? Or should we resume those arguments and then run the risk of losing the unity? One of the things I said in that video also is that when we talk about doing tshuva, I think this is obvious. I think this is really something that you can't argue with. When we talk about doing tshuva, we're not talking about identifying things that other people are doing wrong. We're not talking about pointing fingers and say, the problem is that you have done this and that's what you have to change. Your mistakes, your bad actions have caused this. That's not tshuva. Tshuva is when each person, each individual, and each community points fingers at themselves, looks inward and says, what do I have to correct? What do I have to change? I said that then. I've been trying very hard to do it over the last 4.5 months. I even think maybe I've gotten somewhere, and others have as well. But here also, there's a problem that people have pointed out to me that I'm starting to see myself as well, which is, okay, so we'll do that. But what happens when I do believe that other people need to change things, and I don't see them learning the lessons that I think they need to learn, and I do need to point out to them, hey, you're doing something wrong, and you have to change that. Again, as soon as I do that, I'm accused, perhaps correctly, of damaging the unity. But if I don't do that, then the problems are not going to change. So how do we manage that? That's what I've been grappling with for the last 4.5 months. And I've reached a point that I think I have something to say about it, which is why I'm making this video. There are certain things that I think we definitely need to do, and they can be done without all that much difficulty. First of all, we can speak more politely and respectfully to each other. Even if we have the same arguments, we can say them differently. It doesn't have to be said with the anger, with the hostility, with the ad hominem attacks, and all the things that were going on before. That, I think, it's clear that it was always out of bounds, and that's something that we have to change. We also might have to learn that even if we feel very strongly about something, we may have to compromise. We may have to accept only part of what, we may have to live with the fact that we're only going to get part of what we want right now, and that for the sake of unity, we may have to compromise on things. That also has been said by many, and I think it's true. But in this video, I want to go beyond that. I think that I want to suggest a new way of looking at what unity actually means, which can actually to sort of redefine how we look at unity. And I think that's something that can help us really move forward. And to do that, I'm going to focus on one specific aspect of the conflicts that rage between us. I think it's one of the most important aspects. I think it's what lays beneath a lot of the things that we're fighting about before October 7th and many of the struggles in the Jewish world over the past years and decades. And that's the conflict between the group, I don't really like these terms, but I'll use them, the group that's called Datim, Charedim, religious, Orthodox, versus those Jews that are called secular, Chiloni, non-Orthodox. That's the cause of a lot of tension here in Israel. It has been since before the state was founded, and it's also one of the major causes of conflict between Jewish communities around the world as well. So I want to use that issue. I want to address that issue in this video, and perhaps the approach I'm going to suggest here can be useful for other things as well. On the one hand, I want to suggest an approach that I think will sound new, but the honest truth is it's not new at all. It's an approach that goes back to a very important article written by Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael. An article he wrote almost 120 years ago called Hador, the generation, or Ma'amar Hador, the article about the generation as it's used here in Israel. He wrote it in 1906. And it's an article that's still discussed very, very often in certain circles here in Israel. But I think in the English-speaking world, it's not widely known. I thought about this article in the context of the current questions a few months ago. And since then, I've spent a lot of time reading it and rereading it again and even studying it with some commentaries that were written on it. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to summarize that article and share a few very brief excerpts from it and tell you why I think this article contains powerful ideas that may give us the way forward. But first, a quick little background. As I said, the article was published in 1906 as part of a collection called Ikvei Hatzon. Rav Kook published this book of essays, of which Hador is the first, as I said, in 1906, which is just 2 years after he made Aliyah, after he came to live here in the land of Israel. He had made Aliyah in 1904 at the age of 38, after having served as a rabbi in several communities in Lithuania and in Latvia before he came here. Already back in Eastern Europe, Rav Kook confronted the conflicts that were going on in the Jewish people of Eastern Europe at that time. By then, the movement known as the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, was in full swing for already several generations, maybe about 100 years. This was a movement that saw Jews embracing the modern secular culture and new ways of thinking that were becoming prevalent in Europe. And in many cases, that caused them to reject and to abandon the traditional way of life, to abandon observance of halakha, of mitzvot, of keeping the commandments of the Torah. And unsurprisingly, those Jews who were still committed, those who became known as Orthodox, were alarmed by this phenomenon, were troubled by this phenomenon, and greeted it with a lot of opposition and hostility. And by the time Rav Kook became an adult towards the end of the 19th century, some of these movements had coalesced around the ideas of socialism. A lot of young Jews of that generation were involved in youth movements that were expressing various socialist ideas, the ideas that eventually became communism, right there in Russia, which were motivated by a desire to improve their own situation and to improve the world at large. They wanted to create a classless society where all people would be equal, where there would be an end to oppression. Some of these groups were also getting involved in Jewish nationalism, which would eventually become known as Zionism. And those were Jews who wanted to create, to come to the land of Israel, to rebuild Jewish national life, to achieve Jewish independence, and thereby to liberate themselves from the shackles of the exile and from the anti-Semitism that we've been experiencing at that point for thousands of years. And many of those young people that were involved, particularly with the socialist and the Zionist movements, saw in the older generations and in the traditional way of life, in the observance of mitzvot, they saw something that was associated with the exile. They saw in it the cause of the problems, and they wanted to liberate themselves from that. They wanted to create what they called a new Jew, and on that basis to solve the problems. And therefore, they looked with disdain at their own parents in many cases and at the older generations, who themselves very often were extremely hostile towards these new movements. And they also considered them to be heretical and causing a lot of damage. So when Rav Kook looked at his generation, and then that was in Europe, and then in 1904 he came to the land of Israel, became the chief rabbi of Yafo, where Tel Aviv would be founded shortly afterwards, and that was exactly the time that the movement known as, the period known as the Second Aliyah was beginning. The Second Aliyah are those socialist young Jews who created the movement known as the Chalutzim, the pioneers, those who built the kibbutzim. They came to the land of Israel with these ideas. They were going to build these collective agricultural settlements based on socialist ideas, based on the new Jew that they wanted to create, completely rejecting Jewish tradition in the process. And from those communities, they wanted to build a Jewish state. And that put them in sharp conflict with the group known at that time as Hayishuv Hayashan, the older traditionalist communities that were based here in Eretz Yisrael for many generations, mainly in places like Yerushalayim and Tzfat and Hebron and Tveria, the four holy cities that were called then, and also some smaller pockets. And the conflict between the Yishuv Hayashan, those traditional Jews who had been living in the Holy Land for generations, who looked very much to these young socialist newcomers like the people that they had tried to get away from in Europe, and those new settlers who the Yishuv Hayashan saw as invaders who were coming in and trying to change the way Jewish life in the land of Israel was going to work, they got into very sharp conflict with each other that looked to Rav Kook very similar to the conflicts he had seen back in Europe. So when Rav Kook sat down in 1906 to write Hador, the generation, what he was looking at was actually two generations. He was looking at Dor Ha'avot, the generation of the parents who represented the tradition, who represented the Torah, who represented the way of life that had carried the Jews throughout the exile, and the Dor Habanim, and the generation of the children, the young socialist, Zionist pioneers who had rejected all of that. And these two groups were very disillusioned with each other. They were very angry at each other. They blamed each other for all of the problems, and there was no communication really between them. And it's on that background that Rav Kook sat down and wrote his article called Hador. Now, the article is written in, Rav Kook in general wrote in very difficult poetic Hebrew. The article is also very long, and we're not going to read it here. What I am going to do is share with you, and I'll put the next slide on the screen already. What I'd like to do is to share with you, I'd like to share with you a few excerpts. These are edited excerpts, even. I took passages from different places. In some cases, I took just pieces of sentences because I didn't want to get bogged down in Rav Kook's poetry and his very difficult ideas. But I do want to share with you the fundamental point he made, which, as I said, I think is a crucial one. So let's read through these selections, and through them, I'll try to share with you what I think is so significant about Rav Kook's ideas. So we'll start with a passage that's actually the very beginning of the essay. He starts with basically a lament about the difficult situation that he sees among his brethren at this time. He talks about hamachov hagadol, this great pain, hamidaket hanefesh, biagon nora, this great pain that is causing us so much sorrow. Avotu banim yachdav shel umah shlema, parents and children alike, an entire nation are really, really suffering. Ha'ke'ev kol kach gadol. The way he sees it, the pain that Am Yisrael is in, this is a period also with a lot of anti-Semitism. In Russia, there had been major pogroms, and many Jews had been killed. Here in the land of Israel, life was very, very difficult. Poverty and disease and a corrupt Turkish government, Ottoman government that was oppressing the Jews, attacks from the local Arabs. Everywhere Jews were, at least in Eastern Europe and here in Israel, which is all Rav Kook really saw, things were really bad. But he says the pain is so great, ha'ke'ev kol kach gadol, ad shenutal mimenu gam ken et kishrona dibur. It's caused people to no longer be able to speak. And later on in the essay he says, yesh lo dibur, they can speak, aval lo l'saper nig'ei levavo, leman yarviach lo. They don't have the ability to speak to each other. They don't have the ability to share their pain and therefore to sort of find some comfort. But rather, when they can speak, ki'im levazot u'lecharef u'litkatzef u'lekalel. All they can do is attack each other and curse each other and insult each other. And that only makes the pain even worse. But after, he goes on for a few pages like that, sort of lamenting the terrible situation. And then suddenly he writes, Hasurayanai, silence my thoughts. Don't mourn anymore. He suddenly turns optimistic. Yesh shemesh tzedakah zorachat, the sun is shining, and it can bring healing to us. Timached dim'ah migal kol panim, tears can be wiped away. Why? He just explained how terrible the situation is. And he makes a fascinating statement. He says, Dorenu, our generation, hu dor nifla. Again, this is coming from a Haredi rabbi, from an Orthodox rabbi who's talking about a generation whose youth, in large measure, have completely and rebelliously rejected everything he stands for, or at least so it looks. And he says about these young people, Dorenu hu dor nifla. Our generation is an amazing one. Shekulo timahon, entirely mysterious. Kashe ma'od limtsolo dugma b'chol divrei yameinu. It's hard to find a generation like this in all of history. And he says this generation is one big paradox. Hu murkav mehafachim shonim. It's a composite of opposites that don't seem to match. Choshech ve'or mishamshim bo be'erbuvia. Light and darkness are intermingled in this generation. Hu shafel v'arud. This generation is very shallow and very low. But gam ram v'nisa. But at the same time, it's high and exalted. Hu kulo chayav, gam kulo zakai. The generation is completely guilty and completely righteous. And there Rav Kook is making a direct reference to a Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, which tells us that the Geulah, the final redemption, will come in one of two ways. Either B'dor Shekulo Zakai or B'dor Shekulo Chayav. The ultimate redemption can come, says that Gemara. I believe it's Rabbi Yochanan in Masechet Sanhedrin. I'll try to post on the screen up there the reference. He says that the redemption will come either in a generation that's completely righteous and therefore deserves the redemption, or in a generation that's completely guilty and therefore there's no choice but to redeem them. When Rav Kook references that Gemara about his generation, he's doing two things. First of all, he's saying this is the generation of the redemption, and we'll see in a minute, he's going to be making that point very clearly again further on. This is the generation of the redemption, and the redemption, Rabbi Yochanan said, can come either in a generation that's completely guilty or completely righteous. This generation is both. Kulo chayav, gam kulo zakai. Now, what does Rav Kook mean by that? So, let's see what he says in this next selection here. He tells us, B'chol hazmanim u'v'chol hadorot, in all previous generations, there were generations that were good and there were generations that were sinful. But anachnu ro'im b'dor shehu malei pirtzot, if you have a generation that had rejected the Torah, that was sinful, ha'pirtzot ovrot al pnei kol chugo ha'musari l'chol tzdadav. So, their violations of the Torah spread out through all different aspects of the Torah. A generation that rejected God and rejected holiness also rejected morality. If you think about, for example, some of the things we read about in the times of Tanakh, in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges, for example, or in the kingdom of Israel under the reign of Achav, or other times like that, and also later in history, when the people were guilty of religious sins, they were also usually guilty of moral sins of various types, of oppressing the poor, of various forms of social injustice, sexual immorality, and all sorts of things like that. As Rav Kook writes here, Dor shachuach Eloha, Dor shocheach Eloha, who gam came Dor sorer umoreh, zolel v'soveh. A generation that rejects God is also a generation that he compares to the biblical Ben Sorer Moreh, the rebellious son that in the book of Dvarim we're told has to basically be killed because that child is irredeemably evil. But he says, Muzarhu Hador Hazeh, but this generation is different. Shovavhu Paraihu, it's mischievous, it's wild. Aval Gam Na'aleh V'nisa. And yet, at the same time, it is lofty. It's exalted, and therefore, what comes out of that is that the way in which we dealt with evil or sinful generations in the past shouldn't be relevant here. And in the next passage that we'll see here, he quotes or at least references a Mishnah in Masechet Sotah. He says, chutzpah yasge, impudence or disrespectfulness is increasing. Ein haben mitbayesh me'aviv, children aren't ashamed in front of their parents. Narim pnei zekenim yalbinu, they're being shameful to their parents. Now he's quoting a description that the Mishnah in Masechet Sotah gives of the time known as Ikva de Mashiach, the footsteps of the Messiah, the generation right before the redemption. And we'll see that Rav Kook later on in one of the selections I'll give you at the end, we'll see he uses that exact expression. He's clearly here again identifying this as that generation, and he's saying exactly what the Mishnah said we were going to see is what we're going to see. They're disrespectful and they're brazen. Ulu matzeh, but at the same time, rigshay hachesed, hayosher, hamishpat, v'achemla. But we're seeing things that don't seem to match that. Because look what they're involved in. They're socialists. They're speaking of kindness. They're speaking of universal justice, of honesty, of compassion. That's not like the people we read about, for example, in the book of Shoftim, the terrible story of the Pilegesh Begiva, when they raped and murdered that woman. We're not talking about lawless anshe bliya'al, to use the biblical term. We're not talking about people who have thrown off all yokes of restraint. To the contrary, these are people that are deeply concerned with morality. And not only that, he mentions here koach hamadai v'ha'ideali. They're interested in science, they're interested in intellectual development, they're interested in literature, they have ideals, they're idealistic, they have ideologies. How do we make sense of this? What does it all mean? And here Rav Kook comes and says something incredibly dramatic, earth-shattering. Again, when we look at this next selection, we have to remember that we're talking about a Haredi rabbi who's referring to looking at a group of young people who are provocatively rejecting everything he stands for, willfully violating the Torah. And yet he says there's so much good in them. Even if their conclusions are wrong, even if they're doing the wrong things, they're also doing some right things, and more importantly, their intentions are good, and they have a deep inner sense of good things. So how do we reconcile that paradox? So listen to this incredibly revolutionary idea. He says, Chelek gadol me'ador ha'tzair einenu chash kol kavod l'chol mashu hugal. Many of these people, a large segment of the young generation, has absolutely no respect for everything they've learned from their parents and teachers for the Torah. Aval lo mipnei she'ufla nafsho. It's not because they have something dark or evil in their soul or a weakness of spirit. It's because they haven't been taught the Torah properly. It's because of the way in which the Torah had been looked at by the previous generation. The way, what does he say here? The way they've been taught, sheyabit al yado al chok ve'amishpat al hamisoret ve'ha'emunah bichlal al kol tahor v'kodesh v'kadosh. Everything that is holy, everything that is beautiful in the Torah, the earlier generations had come accustomed to looking at it in a very small way. And why did that happen? Mipnei mi'ut ha'avoda b'talmudo shel yisodei haregesh ve'hadat shebemirchav ha'torah. Because the earlier generations were so busy just surviving spiritually and surviving physically, and therefore they basically limited themselves mostly to intricate details of halacha and to very, very basic understandings of Jewish spirituality. And therefore the Torah that they're teaching to this new generation who has such lofty ideals appears to this generation. He references a pasuk in Eicha, hu am zahav v'shuna ketem atov. Ad nidmelo, right? All the gold has faded, and therefore nidmelo, it looks incorrectly. But it looks to this new generation, shakol hu shofel harbe me'erko. When they see the Torah, they're not really seeing the Torah. They're seeing the diminished Torah that their parents and their teachers are showing them. And therefore, says Rav Kook, b'mesibot hakdumot, in earlier generations, mitzad ha'tchuna shel limud ha'torani ha'musari v'ha'ma'asi haya murgal liyot lavush ba b'yamim she'avaru, the way in which Torah was taught, all the aspects of Torah in previous generations, botam hayamim bichlalo od lo haya klalut hador muchshar l'damot. It's because those previous generations couldn't even imagine themselves as being ra'ui l'she'ifot gedolot. They couldn't even imagine themselves as having great spiritual ambitions. And therefore, when their teachers, rebuked them and tried to get them to improve spiritually, all they were speaking about was kol ha'tachluav ha'musarim hayu yicholim likanes rak be'ezo shiflut shel ta'ava me'ezo sug shehi. Some kind of base, lustful desires. That's what their teachers talked to them about. And therefore, even the rebukes that they had received and that they're giving this generation, it's not speaking to them. It's not that the present generation is beneath the Torah. It's that they're above the version of Torah that they're being taught. And therefore, he says the following: the ha'aliyah shel haklal ha'hamoni, the fact that this generation is actually so spiritually advanced and morally advanced and intellectually advanced, paradoxically, that's what caused the fall. Sha'ador shu motzei et kol mashu shomeh v'ro'eh mehorim u'morim katan me'erko. A generation that basically finds everything that they're being taught beneath them, so of course they reject the Torah. They're not really rejecting the Torah. They're rejecting the diminished version of the Torah that they've been shown. And not only that, when the previous generation tries to rebuke them with the types of things that worked for them, with fire and brimstone and threats of divine retribution, they're not afraid either. Thoughts of burning in hell don't speak to them either. Maybe to earlier generations who were in a different situation, it spoke to them. It doesn't speak to this generation. And therefore, Rav Kook says, Hu lo yuchal lashuv miyirah. If you try to sort of subdue them and get them to do what's called tshuva miyira, to repent due to fear, it's not going to work. This generation is not capable of that. Aval me'od muchshar hu lashuv me'ahava sheyirat harumimut titchaber ima. But this generation can do tshuva. They can repent out of love and ultimately out of reverence. So Rav Kook is calling upon the older generation to speak to the younger generation and to get them to repent. And yes, to correct their ways. But you have to speak to them differently. And here's the key point. It's not just about how you speak to them. It's not that Rav Kook was saying we have to change our marketing. We have to talk to them differently. We have to sound much more sophisticated. We have to talk, in fancier language. That's not what Rav Kook is saying. Rav Kook is saying the Torah that we've taught them has been a diminished Torah. In order for us to reach them, to bring them back, we have to change the Torah that we're teaching, which means we have to change the Torah that we're learning. We have to learn the Torah better. Essentially what he's saying is, those people that are brazenly and provocatively rejecting the Torah, they're ultimately going to teach us Torah. Or at least they're going to enable us to learn Torah differently. And he says, Dor Bal Ruach Gadol, a generation with a great soul, with a big heart, and a big spiritual desire. Chafetz umuchrach lachfotz, they have to be looking for b'chol makom shu boneh l'shmoa dvarim gedolim. Big people want to hear big things. They want to hear big ideas. Lo zoti torat hachayim hanitzrechet l'dor shel ikva demashicha. And there he uses that expression that the Mishnah we saw earlier in Sota uses. This is the generation of the footsteps of the Messiah. They can't be taught the old way of the Torah. It doesn't work for them. He says, Knesset Yisrael hitnara l'tchiyah. The congregation of Israel, he's using a mystical term for the collective body of Am Yisrael is waking up. And you can't try to just beat them down. That's not going to work. They have to be shown an elevated and uplifted Torah. And when you show them that Torah, now comes the punchline here. Ba'orach Chaim Hazeh, with this approach, Ahavatam ha'azah shel habanim ha'yikarim la'ameinu la'eretz kodshenu tofia v'ta'ir gamkein. What's going to happen is the great love that this young generation, the ones that we're looking at as rebellious, have such a love for the people of Israel, for the land of Israel. They see things that we don't see. That's going to spread out. And when it does, and when we show them that those things that they're seeing are actually in the Torah, so then they're going to return to God. They're going to see again that shepherd of Israel. Elohei Yisrael. Elohei Olam. V'leiv ha'avot yatchil lahakir et kol ha'otzar hatov ha'skula ha'gnuza shebabanim. So once we learn how to show them that the things they're seeing that maybe we didn't see are actually in the Torah, they'll return to the Torah. They'll return to God. They'll return to mitzvot. So we will be able to teach them and we'll be able to learn from them. We're going to see the things that they taught us, those hidden treasures that are in them. We look at them and we see rebellious ben soreru moreh, but that's wrong. Maybe that was true in earlier generations of sinful people. That's not this generation. These people are pure. These people have, in their intentions, not in their actions. Their actions are mistaken, at least some of them, many of them. But their intentions are pure and they see things that we don't see. So they will learn from us and we will learn from them. And he says it here explicitly at the last piece here. V'chol echad mechavero yikach et kol hatov et kol ha'ne'eh v'hakasher. Each side will take the good from the other. Mishnei hatzdadim. The parents will learn from the children and the children will learn from the parents. And then that's what will lead us to the understanding Sherak al yedei hitadchut haruchanit shel Yisrael hatzair im Yisrael hazaken tavo Yeshua v'titzmach geula. Only through that combination, that fusion of what the older generation sees that the younger doesn't, and what the younger generation sees that the older one doesn't, only that fusion will enable the redemption to come. Now, that was a revolutionary idea when Rav Kook presented it. And later in his life, in his later writings, he elaborated on these ideas and he developed them. And the approach that Rav Kook first articulated in this essay and later on in his teachings as well, it had a huge impact on the method of education in certain institutions here in Israel. It's a very interesting question to contemplate what that approach has accomplished, how things are different than they would have been had Rav Kook not made these really revolutionary and dramatic shifts in thinking. Clearly, though, the complete fulfillment of Rav Kook's vision has not yet happened. Now, for many years in certain educational circles here in Israel, there's been a debate about this essay, Ma'amar Hador. Basically, the question is, okay, we understand what Rav Kook was saying back then, now it's almost 120 years ago, about that generation, but is that at all relevant today? Sometimes this debate goes by the name Ma'amar Hador Lidoro or Lidorot. Was the article about the generation, was it written for its generation or for all generations? And those who say that it's not really relevant anymore basically have said that, look, back then, okay, they were rejecting the Torah, they were even rejecting God, but as Rav Kook showed, they had such idealism, they were committed to building a country, they were idealistic, they had a vision. And today's generation, some have characterized as just shallow, materialistic, self-absorbed, the TikTok generation, and things like that. And there were those who said that this generation, you can't look at this way and we have to take a completely different approach. I never agreed with that. I've always felt Ma'amar Hador Lidorot, and I've always felt that it's as relevant now as it was then. But I think that anyone who thought otherwise, after October 7th, after Simchat Torah of this year, has to apologize for calling them a TikTok generation. I think what we saw of the young people of this generation who dropped everything and got on planes from places like India and who knows where, and rushed into battle and risked their lives and tragically sometimes lost their lives or lost limbs or suffered injuries, knowing full well what they were getting themselves into, knowing very clearly, seeing very clearly who they are, who their people is, what they're fighting for and what they represent. I think it's 100% clear that the young generation today they're different. I'll get back to that in a minute. They're different than the generation of 120 years ago, but they're no less committed and they're no less deep inside. If anything, they're even greater. And therefore, the question is, okay, so first of all, that's why I think that this essay is important. But I want to make clear, I'm not saying that we should cut and paste what Rav Kook was saying about that generation back then to the generation now, and the specific examples he gives, which we didn't really go into, I don't think are directly relevant. Many things have changed from his day to ours, including the fact that at this point it's no longer the parents' generation and the young generation. There are people from various generations with different viewpoints, and there maybe is more than two groups, and there are lots of different opinions out there, and so not everything is the same. But the fundamental philosophy that, again, was quite a revolution, which Rav Kook articulated in that essay, that these so-called non-religious or secular Jews can teach us about how to understand the Torah better, that we need to separate our critique of their actions or of their positions from the great esteem that we have to have and the admiration we have to have for their pure motivations, even if we think that those motivations don't lead to the correct actions, and that when they're rejecting the Torah, they may actually be rejecting an inadequate version of the Torah that we taught them because they may be seeing things that we don't see. I think all of that is even more relevant today than it was in Rav Kook's time. And this connects to some of the ideas and perspectives that I tried to communicate in my Am Levadad video series, particularly video number 5, which is called Judaism is Not a Religion. And if you watch that video or you read the transcript, I try to show there, I give just a few examples about how the Torah is much, much bigger than what we call religion. And that the mitzvot of the Torah cover many things more than those things that we associate with the types of mitzvot that these so-called religious Orthodox Jews keep and these so-called non-religious or secular Jews don't keep. Sometimes when these other groups are fighting with us or pushing back against us, they may actually be highlighting parts of the Torah that we haven't paid enough attention to. And just like Rav Kook said, the Dor HaBanim of his generation, the youth of his generation, have something to teach their parents. The so-called Chiloni, secular Jews of our generation, I think, have a lot to teach us, the religious Jews, and we have what to teach them as well. And therefore the key is to, yes, continue to debate, continue to discuss, and even to point out what we think other people are doing wrong, to do it certainly respectfully, as I said before, but not just politely, genuinely respectfully, genuinely to listen to what they're saying, to realize that we very probably have to update our own understandings of the Torah based on what we've learned from them, and then we'll be able to teach the Torah to them. And both of us, as Rav Kook said, will emerge with a better understanding, and then we can achieve that unity. What Rav Kook predicted and looked forward to 120 years ago, I think can happen today. And if we do that, then we will succeed in, yes, being able to argue, not just without damaging the unity that we have now, but by building a deeper and more genuine unity that has room for all of us in it. And if we do that, then this war really will be transformative. We really will have changed as a result. And as Rav Kook said, that should lead to the final Geula. Bimhera v'yameinu. That's our mission.